Great. Thanks, Brenny. Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. So today we're going to talk about some of the trends we think are going to happen in the near future. There's a lot to talk about. So here are some of the topics we're going to go into. So first I'm going to start a little bit more macro. One thing we expect is increased M&A in the space, health giants getting into each other's businesses, tech giants going further into healthcare, challenges to lab testing encompass a greater focus on Medicaid, a closer examination of mobile internet usage with mental health, more companies using sleep as a launchpad into health, light being used in diagnostic and therapeutic capacities in a more extended sense and more in the field, patient financing options, and the blockchain hype. So there's a lot to talk about, which is why I'm just going to dive straight in. First, an increase in digital health M&A. Over the past few years, we've seen digital health M&A not only decline, but large exits have been few and far between. This is a combination of a few factors, including more private capital available, higher valuations, and incumbent companies being somewhat understandably wary of the claims that a lot of these companies are making. But now, thanks to corporate tax reform, a lot of companies are getting cash back. And healthcare is actually one of the sectors that's benefiting the most directly, but also a lot of large companies in tech and industrials like Apple and GE, they all have healthcare divisions too. So just generally, people that are getting involved in healthcare now have more money to do things like acquire companies. And clearly, these companies are not afraid to use the cash. We've already seen several multi-billion-dollar deals in the biotech sector, and other companies are already talking about their plans to use the money when it comes in. And digital health companies are good possible acquisition targets because they can bring expertise that complements these companies, especially as software becomes a bigger part of healthcare. Pharma companies, for example, could look at digital health in a few ways. If drug discovery actually becomes a more software-driven process, then bringing in these AI biology companies in-house could set them up with AI expertise. We've talked extensively in the past about how pharma is moving into a services-oriented direction, which is why digital therapeutics companies could also be a good fit. And we already have seen one example of this with Roche acquiring MySugar, a diabetes management company. Or since direct-to-consumer distribution of some of the more lower-risk commodity products like birth control, hair loss, wellness items are becoming more popular, owning one of the asynchronous direct-to-consumer telemedicine companies could be a play both in the services side of things and in the distribution. Med device companies could also look at digital health companies like wearables, which have been faltering lately, to bring in design and consumer experience expertise as that becomes a higher priority metric, especially with some of the new regulations like the Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act, which are sort of opening the doorway for some of these more over-the-counter medical devices. Additionally, they could look for companies that sell to different demographics, like tools to improve doctor productivity, for example, or just generally areas to boost their pipeline. And finally, as software and analysis becomes a bigger differentiator for medical devices, having that expertise in-house is going to be more important. Or on the flip side, these AI plus healthcare companies could bring health expertise to tech giants who are starting to get more involved in the space. This could be on the medical device side, or it could be a company that sits at a crucial area where health data flows through, or a company that set up an extensive operation, distribution, and relationship network in the healthcare space already. And speaking of crossing lines, another trend we expect to accelerate is the crossing of business lines from healthcare giants. This probably shouldn't shock many of you, but prices keep going up for services, goods, really everything, even though usage is going down. And part of the reason behind this, and there are a few, is the fact that consolidation among hospitals, pharma companies, insurance companies in the last few years have given a few entities extremely high pricing power. So they kind of look like pseudo monopolies, and they can price higher and higher. The issue is that you can only consolidate so far. We've seen some massive antitrust blocks in all different parts of healthcare, and there's a clear anti-competitive spotlight forming in the healthcare space. Plus, tech giants entering the arena with a business model that makes most of its money without healthcare means these giants are figuring out how to become more defensible, which for a lot of them means bundling a bunch of services together and selling them as a package and making them less dependent on any singular area, which could be disrupted. So CVS is a good example of that. Instead of just being a distribution company, which is really one area Amazon is proficient at, they acquired Aetna, and now they look more like a distribution and services company, which is a much more attractive and defensible bundle. And you can see that even though it wasn't explicitly stated, one of the big drivers behind CVS Aetna was the threat of Amazon. So clearly tech giants are already starting to impact the psyche of people in the healthcare space. So now we're starting to see large acquisitions like CVS and also United Health acquiring DaVita Medical Group, notable partnerships like Cleveland Clinic setting up plans with both Oscar and Humana, and companies getting into new business lines like hospitals setting up their own generics manufacturing. So when you take all of these factors together, the other healthcare giants are going to be forced to respond if they haven't done so already. So we see this trend as becoming more and more commonplace as companies move to become more full-service health channels. And the tech giants driving this line crossing are circling healthcare, but they're getting closer and closer. Actually, just today, Amazon, in partnership with Berkshire Hathaway and JP Morgan, announced that they were setting up their own healthcare company. And I promise I put together this deck before knowing that, so I wasn't, cheating. But anyway, this year we expect to see tech companies go from vaguely talking about healthcare to taking tangible steps. First, there are more and more announcements and media attention looking at tech giants in the health space, which you can see here with our trends tool, which monitors media chatter. And almost every single tech giant has either been investing in healthcare through venture arms or setting up dedicated healthcare divisions. They say every company becomes a tech company in the long run, but maybe every tech company becomes a healthcare in the long run too. Tech companies bring several advantages to the table over existing healthcare players: strong software and AI teams, direct-to-consumer relationships and higher net promoter scores, and healthy revenue streams outside of healthcare, which can help them weather the uncertainties of healthcare, and it changes their incentives in the space. They don't actually have to make a bulk of their revenue from healthcare. Plus, they're scooping up talent. With a bigger healthcare roster and people who know the space and have relationships, these tech companies are building teams to build and push products. So everything from Amazon poaching people knowledgeable in the health cloud services industry, or Apple hiring Stanford's Digital Health Executive Accelerator. We're really seeing some large personnel moves in the space. Tech companies are also going through the regulatory routes that they need. Apple is working with the FDA to use their watch to detect atrial fibrillation, and Amazon has been looking at getting a wholesale pharmacy license. And a lot of the major tech companies have also been filing patents related to healthcare space. So a lot of them are specifically focusing on new non-invasive monitoring systems using some sort of AI. I briefly saw that Microsoft filed a new patent today using our patent search, and they're also now looking at sort of surface level blood movements. Amazon entrance in particular is worrying executives across the board, healthcare and not. We've been seeing more analysts ask questions about how companies plan to respond to the Amazon threats. And even today, if you look at major healthcare stocks like CVS, United, Express Scripts, just the mention that Amazon was going to set up a healthcare company sent all of their stocks down 5%, even though we don't know what they're actually doing. So companies are particularly sensitive about them. And maybe that's a good thing. Healthcare could use the threat of these companies with different business models to actually spur them into changing things. Amazon is one of the most consumer-centric businesses in the world. Healthcare companies are almost the opposite of that, and the entrance of these tech giants might force them to rethink and restructure a lot of their business. Another tech giant is actually enabling another trend which we expect to see, which is more virtual siteless trials increasing in frequency. Apple has been introducing the idea of doing mobile research studies at scale, which is step one, just getting people comfortable with that idea. ResearchKit has been showing the benefits of mobile studies. It helps recruit more patients from a more diverse pool for less cost, and it's easier to scale a study with no site overhead. Plus, using mobile phones and trackers means more usable data, whether that's during an episode like a seizure, or environmental data, which is useful for asthma and COPD studies. And directors of research are taking notice. Studies with 10,000 people would take a long time just to recruit and coordinate between multiple different entities. Now ResearchKit is doing a year's worth of work in 24 hours and has been scaling even further beyond that. Drug companies are getting acquainted with this and setting up their own studies on the ResearchKit platform. Everyone from GSK to Pfizer, Purdue are all trying to figure out how they fit on top of ResearchKit. Other companies like 23andMe are using their direct-to-consumer relationships they've already built to get customers to participate in their own research studies from home. I remember they did one study where customers would take ice buckets and then dunk their hands in for a certain amount of times, and 23andMe was asking that to help draw connections between pain tolerance and different genotypes. And the reason this is important is because 23andMe is getting into this direct-to-consumer research and siteless research, and they're also planning to make their own drugs. And so that could be the beginning of a new pharma competitor where virtual trials are at their core and could spur pharma into taking this leap themselves. And that brings us to step two, which is proving that siteless trials can actually work. In the past, several drug companies have tried to get into these virtual siteless trials, but none could actually make it work out because either they couldn't recruit enough people or the logistics didn't work out, and so the idea started to fizzle. And just in case people don't know what I'm talking about, siteless trials basically use a combination of tech tools like mobile phones, connected hardware, and telemedicine to distribute whatever needs to be distributed and monitor participants and then analyze the results, all pretty much remotely. A traditional clinical research organization does this using physical sites. The problem with that is that physical sites are a very, very expensive part of running a clinical trial operation. Site recruitment, retention, and staffing costs are not insignificant and make it more difficult for participants since they actually have to go to the sites themselves, and their inherent sort of strangleholds to using physical sites in terms of where you can set up geographically and the number of people that need to actually run the site. Companies like Science 37 are trying to become the new CRO, clinical research organization, using a siteless model with tools I mentioned before. In fact, there are several companies working in this space now, but Science 37 is one of the more well-funded. Importantly, Science 37 has actually run a successful trial. And it's important that this was a smaller biotech company called AOBiome, because this could be one of the tools that smaller outfits use to help them compete against some of the larger companies, and also this is probably a cheaper way to actually get their clinical trials done. So even though virtual trials have been talked about in the past, we think that all of these factors together will push them towards further adoption this year. So that's not good news for existing clinical research organizations that don't adapt, but they aren't the only incumbent company we think is going to see a shakeup this year. Lab testing giants are going to see their own share of challenges this year. For some context, lab testing is a large space, more than $50 billion large. New Medicare reimbursements, though, are putting the pressure on existing testing centers. Medicare is planning to cut their reimbursements of tests by 10% each year, slowly to reduce expenditure in this space. Quest Diagnostics and LabCorp, the two big independent lab players, are going to feel the crunch because of this. LabCorp has already begun to diversify into other business lines, recently with investments in different startups, while Quest has been much more focused on acquiring hospital labs and consolidating, so they might be in a more risky position from this regulation and could start diversifying themselves. The stage is also possibly set up for insurers to get involved here. We've talked about the crossing of business lines, so this wouldn't be crazy out of the question. For example, in an article about Clover Health, a Medicare Advantage insurance company, the overwhelming leverage that lab players had gave them a much better negotiating position. and that seems like a similar catalyst for several of the other line crossing initiatives we talked about earlier. An additional threat comes from the form of at-home testing. Rather than making people come to labs, what if the tests went straight to the consumers? We're seeing that with several singular tests, like Athelos, which is testing specifically for cancer, but we're also seeing tests for STDs, sperm count, metabolism, and more. The actual functionality and adoption of these tests is still TBD. I know some people probably still have Theranos nightmares, but they're slowly offering ways to get consumers slowly offering ways to get tests to consumers directly, which is a trend that we're seeing throughout healthcare. And these tests are just the start. This is the front page of LabCorp's search, which are probably some of the more popular tests, but there's a full directory of hundreds of tests that companies could offer, which would theoretically unbundle LabCorp. And certain tests that need to happen more regularly for patients, especially those with chronic diseases, are particularly good segments for new direct-to-consumer testing companies to attack. I don't have a silky smooth segue between these sections, so Medicaid is going to become a bigger focus area. More than 68 million people are enrolled in Medicaid. That's a bit less than a fifth of the population, so obviously this is no small matter. It's also a big part of states' budgets when you include federal assistance. More than a quarter of spend goes to Medicaid. And right now, there's a lot of regulatory flux, but when the dust settles, it's likely that states and players within the space, like providers, are going to have to figure out how to do more with less. This is not a great sign, especially considering the fact that Medicaid spend is actually going up and projected to go up even more, even though enrollment is going down. States expect this due to more people enrolling in the age and disabled groups, which are more expensive, and several of the consolidation problems we talked about before, including higher prices from both providers and drug companies. Managing chronic disease and mental health is really where the opportunity lies in the Medicaid segment. People enrolled in Medicaid are more prone to have mental health issues and also comorbidities with chronic disease, which drive the cost up. In fact, 20% of Medicaid enrollees account for nearly half of the Medicaid dollars going to behavioral health, so managing these particularly high-risk individuals is important. The non-medical issues are also large contributors to medical spend later. Things like housing issues, food insecurity, violence, transportation, and just general system complexity can compound and lead to much higher expenditures later. We're seeing startups target some of these issues specifically, like transportation, benefited enrollments, and follow-ups. And some others are taking a more holistic approach, like CityBlock, which spun out of Google's subsidiary, Sidewalk Labs, and is getting involved in higher Medicaid concentration communities. And Healthify is also looking at the social determinants and how they impact health in these communities. The lines drawn between mental health and associated comorbidities are becoming more clear, but we think this year we're going to learn more about mental health itself, specifically in regards to smartphone and internet usage. We now have a term for a fear of being without access to a phone. It's called nomophobia, very creatively named after no mobile phone phobia. Studies are already coming out which link screen time to depression and suicide. This study found a massive spike in suicide and depressive symptoms after 2011, especially in young women, and also a high correlation to suicide factors and excessive screen use time. Tech leaders and people that help build some of these products are also starting to shift their sentiment about the products themselves, including some of the early builders of social media products and Mark Benioff, who's particularly outspoken. You may have noticed that general sentiment around tech nowadays has been shifting to a more negative tone as a whole. That's also extending to some of the activist investors. So Jana Partners recently wrote an open letter to Apple asking them to address their role in mobile phone addiction and demanding further investigation. And BlackRock CEO Larry Fink wrote in his letter about how companies will need to evaluate their social impact more broadly. This could be a potentially lucrative space for companies working on different forms of mobile addiction, like Onward. We've also seen some more extreme versions of addiction management, like shock bracelets as well. The company is called Pavlok, if you're interested. Onward has actually been showing some early but promising results in porn addicts. So maybe the future will actually be apps to help fight our addiction to other apps. And mental health and internet usage is one intersection we expect to see more focus. Another is sleep and health. Sleep is an attractive area for companies for several reasons. One is similar to other companies that straddle the health and wellness line. They can target a health-conscious consumer base who are willing to pay premiums. While they're building the wellness side of the business and getting revenue there, they can capture important data and build direct-to-consumer relationships as they transition into the health side as they discover more clinically relevant information. We've seen this in other areas like genetics, for example. 23andMe initially started in more of the curiosity and wellness side of things and slowly used that data set to transition into healthcare. So there's a precedent here that's already been set. Sleep apnea is a pretty prevalent condition. About 25 million people in the US suffer from it. It's also very negative on lifestyles. Sleep disorders can put strains on relationships, productivity, etc. And so it's a very high focus area for consumers who might be affected by this. And more research is being done into sleep since we actually don't understand that much about it, which is actually kind of crazy when you think about how big of a role it plays in our life. If you look at the number of studies with sleep in the title, the number has slowly been creeping up. Apple is one of the companies leading the charge to better understand sleep. Not only have they acquired a sleep tracker, it's on the front page of the Health app, and other companies are building on top of Apple tools to understand how they can be used to detect sleep conditions. Other wearable makers are following suit too. Fitbit is using new sensors to detect blood oxygen levels and is planning on doing research into sleep apnea. Wearables as a whole have been faltering due to the lack of actionable data they provide, so companies like Fitbit are understandably looking into health applications, with sleep being a prime candidate, especially for the health-conscious demographic they already target. Other startups are building solutions for different parts of sleep, whether that's medical devices to address sleep apnea, or hardware to help you sleep better, or sleep services or coaches to understand why you're not sleeping well, which is something pretty popular in the athlete communities, and companies involved in sleep content. Arianna Huffington's company, Thrive Global, is focused on the relationship between sleep and productivity. One of the reasons many people say sleep is getting worse is the use of blue light from screens right before you sleep. But light has a lot of other roles to play in healthcare, including diagnostics and therapies. Spectroscopy, which analyzes how light interacts with matter, is being used in a diagnostic function. We're seeing this for all different types of diseases, whether that's assessing cancerous moles or checking for ear infections, malaria detection, and allergen detection. And one of the things that's actually enabling this is that the newer phones are getting more and more powerful. So not only from a computing perspective, but the hardware itself is getting better. We're seeing startups develop chips that enable spectroscopy. We're seeing new types of lights being used on the phone. So if anyone here has a new iPhone, you can use Face ID, which is largely due to the dot projector they added. And so phones themselves are becoming more useful as diagnostic tools in this capacity. And tech companies know that, so Apple and Google have both filed patents that use everyday hardware and things that you interact with all the time to help passively monitor different biomarkers. We're also seeing some people improvise and turn phones combined with the cameras and UV light and faster processors to create mobile fluorescence microscope functions. So fluorescence detection can be used to understand the prevalence of different diseases in different samples. So this is actually very important, especially in low resource settings, like such as in the field or in areas in areas where there might be infectious disease breaking out. So we're already starting to see more studies which prove that mobile phones can be used to basically create relatively accurate fluorescence microscopes in the field. And light isn't just being used in a diagnostic capacity, it's also being used in a therapy capacity. So phototherapy, which uses light to address different diseases, is being used across areas like pediatric jaundice, skin conditions, and even different neurological disorders. And so there are all these cool new therapies coming out, but the real problem is, how are patients going to pay for this? This is becoming a much bigger problem. High deductible plans are becoming more and more prevalent, and that's making not only consumers active shoppers of their own healthcare, but also it means that more companies have HSA plans attached to these high deductible plans. The problem is that people are still finding it increasingly difficult to pay for healthcare, whether that's paying for the health insurance itself, the co-pays, or the deductibles. People simply can't afford to pay the upfront costs. And this is bad because people are actually skipping care because they can't pay for it. And that has negative long-term health outcomes. If people are postponing getting care when they need it, or using alternatives, or skipping doses of medicine, that causes more healthcare expenditure in the long run. And so now we're seeing a new crop of companies that are focused on ways to make it easier to actually pay for healthcare itself. One example is insurance for insurance, which is, we'll say, interesting as a business model, but more seriously, we're seeing things like flexible healthcare lines of credit. So companies like GreenSky and Parasil are offering ways to help patients pay for some high upfront payments using debt and credit lines. We're also seeing new HSA companies like Amino, which was a ZocDoc competitor, recently released their own HSA. HSAs are a generally pretty complicated place that most employees don't even know that they have or the benefits of. So some companies are simply trying to make that a more simplified and clearer process. Plus, we're starting to see a crop of companies, blockchain companies, that are hoping to turn patient data into money to help them pay for different areas. So companies like Doc.ai, which are incentivizing patients to contribute their data to different studies in return for bounties, or Sweatcoin, which helps turn healthy behaviors like taking steps into currency. It was at the top of the free app section for a little bit, so it was definitely gaining some popularity. And in the future, maybe we'll see personalized and individualized pricing for patients. We're already seeing the buzzword personalized medicine take off in the last few years, but what about personalized pricing? It's happened in other sectors like Uber and Amazon, so maybe that could come to healthcare as well. And I know we talked a little bit about blockchain, but just to wrap up this presentation, blockchain hype is going to continue to really just be hype. So in theory, blockchain actually addresses some problems that are acutely faced in healthcare. So data governance and interoperability, which probably shouldn't surprise anyone if you're involved in the healthcare space. The authenticity of goods, so counterfeit drugs is a huge problem, especially outside the US, so this could help address that. And also supply chain management as a whole. And also faster rules-based authorizations and adjudication. So if you're, especially in healthcare where timing could be of the essence, making sure you get authorizations in a timely manner and having claims settled quickly is an interesting promise that blockchain provides. And it's becoming an attractive place for healthcare companies, so ICOs have been seriously taking off, and it's a less regulated place that a lot of companies are turning to raise money now. And media is definitely compounding this as they wonder how blockchain can impact healthcare as a whole. So here we see our trends tool, which again monitors news mentions. And in the grand scheme, we're starting to see new healthcare ICOs pop up. And that's across all different parts of healthcare, whether that's identity management, prior authorization, telemedicine, second opinions, decentralized EMRs, which is a particularly hot area, and even supply chain tracking. Corporates are also slowly piloting systems. We've seen the announcement of some different blockchain projects happening, but right now it's hard to tell what's sort of a PR push and and an announcement that they're getting involved into such a red hot space and what's actually substantial. Also, a lot of the massive price swings in the blockchain plus healthcare space demonstrate that this area still has a lot of volatility, and we've also seen several hacks in the space and malicious actors, and all of this just proves that this is a very risky and unregulated environment right now, which is pretty much the antithesis of the entire healthcare system, and so getting buy-in is going to be very difficult. And so lack of regulation, eager investors, and the promise of new technologies has made this a particularly attractive area, but we're still waiting to see what comes out of it, and we believe that this will mostly turn out to be hype this year. Some good news, though, is that the crackdown on bad actors is happening. The SEC has actually been quite diligent about monitoring this space and setting up frameworks for how they want to approach tokens and securities. And so we can hope that as more, not only infrastructure is built out, but more bodies to ensure bad actors are prevented, hopefully blockchain will actually, in the long run, help healthcare as a whole. And so those were the trends I wanted to talk about today. We have some time now to take questions, so you can either ask it right now, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. You can also reach out to me on Twitter or by email, nkrishnan@cbinsights.com. And for whoever I don't answer, hopefully we can chat some other time. All right, so I'll wait for the questions to come in. So speaking of tech giants getting into healthcare, what are your thoughts about Amazon, JPM, Berkshire announcement? For anyone who's on our digital health newsletter, this is going to be the topic of tomorrow. I think it's pretty vague right now and seemingly intentionally. We'll have to see what this looks like and how it really differs from just what really any other self-insured employer would do. We've seen consortiums in the past. If you Google Amex, Coca-Cola Healthcare, you can see that they have also tried to do this, and the outcomes have been questionable. So, and we're really waiting to see it. So, I think the announcement is pretty vague, and we're still waiting to see. But we'll be writing a little bit more about this tomorrow. What do you think about senior care? Medicare Advantage is one of the sort of hotter areas of healthcare right now, partially because it's a little bit more regulatorily stable, and also you don't see as much switching between plans as you might in the individual or employer market, and so it's become an attractive place for companies to sort of help manage the care of seniors. The issue is, one, how do you scale a solution like that, since it's largely a services-based play, and also where can tech tools really provide actual data. So some of the new Medicare Advantage insurers are betting that data can actually help intervene with some of the higher cost patients before they get admitted. But as a whole of the senior market, especially also because more and more boomers are sort of reaching retirement and the Medicare age, that it seems like a pretty interesting area for the years going forward. Outside of the U.S., what are the major trends to look forward to? As you probably could tell, a lot of the trends we talked about were U.S. based, and that's simply a function of how much time we sort of had, and a few of these can be extended outside of the U.S. One of the big areas we expect to see is, especially in Asia and in China specifically, we're starting to see a huge growth in private insurance plans in the area, and so because of that, an entire health ecosystem is sort of being built. And also just generally outside of the U.S., mobile native populations provide sort of different opportunity sets. More and more people don't have access to care at all, and mobile phones provide one of the few touch points. And so we expect to see more companies build on top of mobile ecosystems across the globe, especially in emerging markets, to help address the issues, especially for rural areas. Additionally, a lot of U.S. companies are actually looking outside of the U.S. to trial different technologies before bringing them here, whether because they have more buy-in from from governments in this area. So companies like Zipline, for example, working with governments in I believe it's Rwanda, but are using that to do do drone blood delivery, for example, or for example, Grail merging with Serena as trying to get a foothold into the early cancer detection market in China. Have you done any research into the rise of primary care startups like VillageMD? We actually have a whole report that we just did about a month ago on the consumerization of healthcare. There are a lot of new primary care models that are coming up. The hard part is understanding how those models can actually scale, since they're largely brick and mortar businesses, and whether or not they can actually improve health outcomes in the long run. But if you see the report, we took a deeper dive there. Let's see. What is the current state of the telemedicine market? Again, this is something that we talked about in this consumerization of healthcare report that we did a few weeks ago. One of telemedicine's big issues is that the business models are still slowly being figured out. Right now, even companies like Teladoc, which have impressively are increasing their population base and utilization, still have utilization in the 5% range. So the problem is that a lot of these telemedicine companies aren't actually taking on the risk of the population that they're servicing, so they don't actually participate in the improved health outcomes as a whole. And so we're seeing new business models come out, like digital therapeutics, or insurance companies putting telemedicine at the forefront, like Oscar, which are really trying to use telemedicine more to make money on the long-term health outcomes than they are just selling the tool itself. But again, you can see more in that report. Let's see. Do you have any insight about EMR modernization done by Cerner, Epic, Athena Health, or other EMR vendors? We don't have any insight about what they're doing internally, but I will say is the recent announcement of Apple making a concerted effort to be a personal health record is probably causing some ripples, at least internally. One of the main sort of arguments against a lot of the EMRs today is that they don't allow for companies to build well on top of the data that they actually have. So if Apple actually creates a robust third-party ecosystem to build on top of the personal health app, then that actually could theoretically pose a threat to a lot of these companies, and so they might have to revisit a lot of their existing business models. Thoughts on diabetes monitoring when you sensors, Apple Watch, etc. Don't have a ton of thoughts here. They're clearly they've been poached. We've done a long form research report on Apple and healthcare, and they're clearly looking to the non-invasive glucose monitoring space using different techniques. And Google's also involved in this with their contact lens in partnership with Dexcom. Non-invasive monitoring as a whole is one of the holy grails of healthcare. It's definitely really hard to crack, but we see them using new techniques like tear monitoring and spectroscopy to attempt that, and they have the money to trial and error a bit. So and also Fitbit actually recently partnered with Sano, which is trying to do something similar. So we expect them to at least be experimenting. I'll do a couple more, and then I will try to answer the rest of them later. On sleeping, are you seeing any innovation on sleep meds? One thing we've noticed is that there are more companies now addressing low-grade sleep problems. So there's a cosmetics company actually called Lush, which created a cream that basically dispersed melatonin through the skin and claimed to be able to address sleep disorders, and that sold out nearly immediately. And a lot of these companies that I mentioned here are trying to attract that more low-grade, not necessarily medically severe level of medical disorder level of sleep problems. And as more and more people start sort of experiencing sleep issues, this could be a potentially lucrative space. I'll do one more and then I will keep going. What are the advantages of healthcare companies issuing ICOs? I mean, one potential benefit is that they actually have a better incentive structure for the actual users and patients who most companies are actually making money off a lot of companies are making money off patient data, and patients aren't actually reaping the benefits of that. So you get to actually incentivize the patient population to get involved sort of in healthcare more directly. Also, right now, it's easier if you're an early stage company just simply because it's less regulated, which isn't necessarily a good thing because it also exposes you to extreme price volatility and also, not necessarily actors that have long-term financial interests in mind for your company. But there are some advantages to doing an ICO. So that's all the time I have for right now. I'll try to answer as many questions as I can later. But again, you can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email, and I'll try to address as many as possible.